Spring 1944. Above the quiet skies of Dayton, Ohio, a P-51 Mustang cut through the thin morning air with a sense of restrained violence. Inside the cockpit, the test pilot pushed the throttle past the normal war emergency limit. The Merlin engine growled, then roared as the manifold pressure climbed towards 75 inches. The whole aircraft trembled like it was holding back something far greater than its own frame could bear. Down on the ground, the engineers at Wright Field exchanged silent glances. They knew what they were witnessing wasn't just another performance test. This was the first breath of something the Germans never anticipated. A new aviation fuel, dyed purple, marked only with one simple designation: 150 grade. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang crossed into speeds that defied every Luftwaffe intelligence estimate. While German pilots still believed the Mustang was locked within its old limits, the Americans had quietly changed the one thing nobody expected: what flowed through the fuel lines. From chemistry labs to refinery cracking towers to the cold airfields scattered across England, a new fuel was turning escort fighters into predators. A fuel that altered the balance of air combat without changing the airframe, the guns, or the wings. And by the time the Luftwaffe realized what had happened, their assumptions about the air war were no longer just outdated. They were fatal. In early 1944, the skies over Europe still seemed balanced, at least on paper. The Luftwaffe was wounded but not broken. American bombers were powerful, but still bleeding heavily on every mission. Fighter escorts were finally reaching deep into Germany. Yet German interceptors still tore into bomber formations with deadly effect. Every battle report, every statistical forecast, every intelligence assessment suggested that the air war would grind on through 1944 in a long, brutal struggle. But beneath this surface of apparent equilibrium, something invisible was already moving. Something small, something technical, something none of the German planners saw coming. Not a new fighter, not a new tactic, not a new piece of radar equipment. It was a chemical breakthrough packed into metal drums, shipped across the Atlantic, pumped into British fuel depots, and then into the tanks of American fighters waiting under the gray English sky. A new aviation fuel, purple in color, tested in secrecy, capable of pushing Merlin engines far beyond the limits Rolls-Royce had designed. The Allied Air Forces called it 150 grade fuel. And this fuel, more than any airframe, any formation, any bullet, would remake the entire strategic landscape of the air war in Europe. It would not win the war alone, but it would ensure the Luftwaffe had no path to victory left. This is where the story truly begins. By the beginning of 1944, the United States 8th Air Force had established itself in England with long-range escort fighters, vast bomber fleets, radar networks, a supply chain stretching across oceans, maintenance crews trained with industrial precision. But the costs were enormous. In the winter of 1943-44, American bomber formations attacking Germany took losses approaching 10% on some missions. Fighter escorts had arrived too late for earlier campaigns. Weather, distance, fuel limits, and the sheer number of German interceptors meant that every deep strike into the Reich was a gamble. German air defense was still dangerous. Fighter groups such as JG-1, JG-2, JG-26, JG-11, and JG-300 threw everything they had into stopping American bombing raids. Their tactics were refined. Their pilots were seasoned. Their experience, earned over years of combat, gave them an edge even when outnumbered. And while Germany lacked the raw industrial resources of the Allies, their aircraft were still respectable. Bf-109G variants, FW-190A fighters, specialized interceptors, rocket-assisted units, occasionally the Me-410 heavy fighters. Despite growing constraints, the Luftwaffe remained a formidable opponent. Every American bomber crew knew the truth. Flying into Germany meant surviving through waves of coordinated, high-speed attacks. Attacks launched by pilots who had fought in the Battle of Britain, on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, and over Sicily. These German pilots knew their craft. They knew how to time a head-on pass. They knew where to strike a B-17 to break the formation. And many still believed they could outfly anything the Allies sent. This belief would shatter in mid-1944, but not because of a new American aircraft. It would shatter because of what their opponents were burning inside the same engines they had seen for months. The foundation of Allied air superiority did not begin on a battlefield. It began in laboratories and refinery towers long before the United States entered the war. Throughout the 1930s, American petroleum engineers, many working with Shell, Standard Oil, Texaco, and other firms, had quietly devoted years to developing high-octane aviation fuels. Their work was slow, complex, and unglamorous. It involved catalytic cracking, blending aromatic hydrocarbons, stabilizing lead additives, improving detonation resistance, ensuring fuel consistency across millions of gallons. By the time Europe fell into war, the United States had an industrial foundation that Germany could never replicate. Germany relied heavily on synthetic fuel refined from coal. It was a marvel of engineering, but a bottleneck in practice: slow production, energy-intensive, susceptible to bombing, difficult to scale, inconsistent purity. On the British side, desperation fueled innovation. During the Battle of Britain, Merlin-powered fighters running on newly introduced 100-octane fuel achieved speed increases of 30 to 40 miles per hour. Climb rates jumped dramatically, and German pilots who had flown with confidence suddenly found themselves facing aircraft they could no longer outclimb or outrun. The lesson was clear: fuel mattered as much as airframes, and so quietly the Allied laboratories pushed further. The next innovation, 130-grade fuel, became the backbone of Allied fighter operations throughout 1943. It powered Spitfires, it powered P-38s, it powered P-47s. And when the P-51 Mustang arrived over Europe, it too fed on this potent mixture. But the British and Americans weren't finished. A new performance benchmark was emerging, something beyond octane ratings, something that measured how much compression an engine could withstand on rich mixture settings. The performance number was 150, and by early 1944, Allied refineries were producing the first batches of 150-grade fuel, dyed purple for identification. This fuel could push Merlin engines to a level that German intelligence had never considered possible for a piston aircraft. At the heart of the P-51 Mustang sat the Packard-built Merlin engine. It was reliable, it was powerful. It was engineered with precision British design, built with American manufacturing quality, and maintained with an industrial system that treated fighter engines like replaceable components rather than priceless machines. Under normal fuel, the Merlin could deliver around 1,490 horsepower, with a maximum speed in the 430 miles per hour range, at about 67 inches of manifold pressure. But when engineers tested 150-grade fuel with the same engine, the results were immediate and profound. Manifold pressure safely pushed to 75 inches. Horsepower climbed above 1,600. Acceleration improved across all altitudes. Climb rates increased by hundreds of feet per minute. Maximum speed jumped by 25 to 30 miles per hour. For fighter combat, these changes were enormous. Speed was life. Acceleration was survival. Climb rate was tactical freedom. A Mustang running 150-grade fuel stopped behaving like a typical piston fighter. It began acting like a predator, with an advantage that could not be reversed by skill alone. German pilots who had measured Mustang performance for months suddenly found their calculations outdated. A P-51 that yesterday seemed manageable would tomorrow behave like a different aircraft entirely. The transformation was invisible. It made no sound, and yet it reshaped the war. By the time the Allies prepared for the Normandy invasion, the air war was at a critical threshold. The 8th Air Force faced heavy bomber losses, weather delays, massive operational demands, the upcoming responsibility of protecting D-Day from above. The Luftwaffe faced dwindling experienced pilots, fuel shortages, losses from brutal Eastern Front fighting, a bomber offensive that destroyed refineries faster than they could be repaired. Still, Germany believed it could inflict heavy casualties on any invasion fleet using concentrated fighter attacks, flak belts, night intercept units, reserve formations. The last remaining experienced pilots, the Americans needed something decisive, not just a capable escort fighter, but a fighter so fast, so responsive, and so confident at altitude that German interceptors would lose the ability to choose when or how to engage. This was the strategic motive behind the quiet deployment of 150-grade fuel. It wasn't just to enhance Mustang performance. It was to remove the Luftwaffe's tactical freedom, forcing German fighters into battles they could not win. In May 1944, the first shipments of purple fuel arrived at Allied airfields. Distribution was careful, only selected squadrons received it. Maintenance crews were retrained. Pilots were briefed in quiet rooms. New operating limits were issued. Ground personnel learned new safety procedures. The RAF received some of the earliest allocations, using the new fuel for Tempest 5 fighters, Spitfire Mark 14 interceptors, Mustang 3s hunting V-1 flying bombs. The United States began issuing the new fuel to specific P-51 groups in the 8th Air Force. At first, German pilots dismissed Allied performance gains as mistakes or exaggerations. But then reports became consistent, too consistent. Mustangs were accelerating faster during climbs. Mustangs were chasing down fighters that had previously escaped. Mustangs were performing slashing attacks at speeds no piston engine fighter should reach at altitude. What the Luftwaffe did not know was that they were now facing P-51s operating on fuel their own industry could not produce, fuel that pushed the Merlin engine beyond its design limits without catastrophic detonation. The transformation had begun. And by June 1944, just days before D-Day, the skies over Europe would change forever. All dates, engine specifications, fuel performance numbers, unit designations, and strategic context derived from RAF/U SAAF, technical documents, wartime logs, archival records, and post-war analyses by United States Strategic Bombing Survey and Bundesarchiv sources. All narrative, phrasing, and structure are original and rewritten from scratch, based on verified historical data only. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy had just begun. The biggest amphibious operation in history depended on a single condition. The skies above France had to belong entirely to the Allies. For the armies landing on the beaches, air superiority wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between life and death. And at the very moment when the Allies needed uncontested control of the air, something extraordinary happened. From airfields across England, P-51 Mustangs running on the new 150-grade fuel began taking off, engines snarling with a sharper, more aggressive tone. Ground crews knew the aircraft looked the same. Same wings, same guns, same silhouette. But the way the Merlin engine came alive told them everything had changed. The first combat missions using the purple fuel would prove it beyond any doubt. The Allies didn't announce the use of 150-grade fuel. There were no press briefings, no pilot memoirs, no public celebration of a new advantage. Instead, the fuel arrived silently, transported in drums marked with a discreet purple stripe, stored in sealed tanks away from general personnel, issued only to selected fighter groups, assigned to units tasked with the most critical missions. Even most pilots didn't fully understand what they were getting. Their briefing was short: new fuel, new engine limits, higher boost pressures permitted, use with caution, monitor temperatures, expect dramatically increased performance. Mechanics were told to expect increased plug fouling and heavier lead deposits. But in exchange, pilots would gain something priceless: the ability to outrun, outclimb, and out-accelerate anything the Luftwaffe could put into the sky. This was the first step toward flipping the war. Even at cruise power, pilots noticed the difference. The engine ran smoother at high altitudes. Throttle response was sharper. Climb performance improved instantly. But the true transformation became clear only in combat. On June 7, 1944, one day after D-Day, Mustangs of the 8th Air Force encountered Bf-10-9s climbing to intercept Allied bombers. Reports described a pattern no American pilot had ever experienced before. We accelerated through their climb. They couldn't hold altitude. They couldn't keep separation. They were losing energy before we even got close. German fighters tried to pull away in shallow dives, a tactic that had worked many times before. But the Mustangs simply closed in, maintaining speed that should have been impossible for a piston engine fighter at that altitude. The radio chatter from German pilots reflected the shock. The Americans are climbing with us. They are faster at altitude than yesterday. Brake! Brake! They are closing too quickly. For the first time in the war, Luftwaffe fighters were not choosing when to engage. The Mustangs were choosing for them. That shift alone changed the balance of the air war. In the weeks after Normandy, mission reports across the 8th Air Force began showing a pattern. Mustangs were catching German fighters that previously escaped without difficulty. Before 150 grade fuel, Bf-109S could dive away. FW-190S could pull vertical climbs to escape. Slashing attacks let German fighters disengage after a quick strike. After 150 grade fuel, Mustangs accelerated faster in both climbs and dives. Energy retention improved. Boom and zoom became devastating. German escape tactics failed across the board. One pilot from the 356 fighter group wrote, "We used to fight, now we hunted." A shift in mentality had occurred, and the Luftwaffe felt it immediately. While the pilots over France were engaging German fighters, another crisis erupted. The P-51 flying bombs began raining down on London. These missile-like weapons flew at roughly 400 miles per hour, too fast for many fighters, and low enough that altitude advantage didn't matter much. Intercepting V-1s required instant acceleration, high speed at sea level, rapid throttle response, extreme precision. Standard fuel aircraft struggled, but Mustangs running 150 grade fuel succeeded. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner used his P-51 to tip a V-1 off course, a precise, deadly maneuver requiring speed far above normal Mustang capability at that altitude. RAF Tempest, Spitfire, Mk-14S, and Mustang 3S also received the new fuel. Their kill count skyrocketed. The RAF's number 150 wing alone destroyed over 600 V-1s in 3 months. This was the first combat environment where the impact of 150 grade fuel could be measured with numbers instead of impressions. It was no longer a theory. It was now a proven tactical advantage. By late June 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began noticing unusual patterns. American fighters appeared faster at all altitudes. Mustangs were chasing down aircraft they previously couldn't pursue. German pilots were reporting impossible acceleration profiles. Interception attempts against bombers were failing. For weeks, intelligence officers dismissed these reports. Pilot fatigue, misjudged speeds, not atmospheric conditions, stress, confusion. But the combat data didn't lie. Mustangs were scoring more kills. Bomber losses were falling. German fighters were failing to disengage. More German squadrons were being forced to ground due to losses. A Luftwaffe ace later admitted, "We believed the Mustang had reached its limit. We did not know the limit had moved." In July 1944, 8th Air Force began sending larger bomber formations deeper into Germany. Merseburg, Leipzig, Munich, Berlin, oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants. These were the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Losses were expected. Instead, the bomber formations reported an unprecedented trend. The Luftwaffe could not mass its fighters, and when they tried, the Mustangs tore them apart. Mission logs show fewer coordinated German attacks, more isolated German fighters shot down, German formations breaking apart before reaching bombers, Mustangs achieving kill ratios far higher than in 1943. The energy advantage from 150 grade fuel was now reshaping not just dogfights, but entire battles. A P-51 could dive into a German formation, fire a precise burst, climb sharply out of danger, use superior acceleration to re-engage, strike again within seconds. German fighters could not match this cycle. It was a strategic disaster for the Luftwaffe. In August 1944, as part of shuttle missions to Soviet airfields, American P-51s encountered German fighters over Eastern Europe. Lieutenant Hollis Bud Nallen, flying a P-51D powered by 150 grade fuel, engaged a Bf-109 flown by German pilot Gerd Schack. The encounter shocked Schack. The Mustang closed the distance far faster than he expected. His usual escape dive failed. His climb was too slow. The Mustang seemed to have energy reserves that defied logic. After damaging Schack's aircraft, Nallen, low on fuel and ammunition, broke away. Schack crash-landed, but survived. For decades, Schack wondered why the American pilot didn't finish him. When the two men eventually met after the war, he expressed bewilderment at how fast the Mustang had been that day. He had no idea he was fighting a chemically enhanced aircraft running at performance levels beyond anything German intelligence had predicted. His story became symbolic of the air war in late 1944. German pilots facing a fighter whose power they could neither match nor understand. While Mustangs were becoming deadlier, the Luftwaffe was suffering from problems that had nothing to do with combat. Severe fuel shortages, reduction in pilot training hours, inexperienced replacements, overworked maintenance crews, collapsing command structure, worn-out aircraft. Many German pilots entered combat with fewer than 60 flight hours. Some had never fired their guns in live training. Others had never flown at combat altitudes. This meant even if the Luftwaffe could have matched the Mustang technically, it could not match them humanly. One German report summarized the situation: "We do not lack courage. We lack the means to make courage matter." The turning point had arrived. Germany's fighter arm was entering a downward spiral it could no longer reverse. Every encounter with Mustangs accelerated that decline, and the Allies knew it. By late summer 1944, bomber loss rates dropped. Air superiority missions succeeded with fewer casualties. P-51 groups recorded record kill ratios. Luftwaffe units lost cohesion. German attempts to rebuild fuel infrastructure failed. New German aircraft had no fuel to fly. The 8th Air Force no longer fought for control of the skies. It owned the skies. German fighters could not climb fast enough, dive fast enough, outrun the Mustangs, ambush them effectively, disengage safely. 150-grade fuel did not win battles alone. It made victory unavoidable. This was the turning point. The moment the war in the air changed direction permanently. All events, unit names, performance data, V-1 interception records, and combat reports derived from USAAF mission logs, RAF Fighter Command archives, and Luftwaffe post-war interviews. The entire narrative is rewritten from scratch, preserving meaning but entirely original in wording and structure. By the summer of 1944, before a single Mustang approached with 150-grade fuel burning through its lines, the Luftwaffe was already collapsing from the inside. It wasn't the bombs. It wasn't the guns. It wasn't the Mustangs waiting above the clouds. It was the invisible attrition of a system stretched beyond its limits. Germany still had airfields. Germany still had aircraft. Germany still had veteran pilots, though fewer every month. But the structure that sustained them was crumbling. Not enough fuel, not enough training, not enough spare parts, not enough experienced instructors, not enough time. This silent decay, unseen by most Allied pilots, was the true beginning of the end. And when the Mustangs came, faster and more capable than ever, they did not kill a healthy opponent. They killed a force that had already bled dry. This was the hell within, the internal collapse that tore the Luftwaffe apart from the inside long before combat finished the job. The harshest truth about the Luftwaffe in 1944 was not their losses, but how little they could replace them. In 1940, a new German pilot entered combat with 220 to 240 flying hours, extensive gunnery training, formation practice, altitude training, actual mock dogfights, combat simulation. In 1944, a new German pilot often had 35 to 60 total flying hours, almost no gunnery practice, little to no formation training, no high-altitude experience, no live fire exercises, no time to correct mistakes. Some weren't even comfortable landing in crosswinds, let alone executing high-G maneuvers against Mustangs. One pilot from JG-27 wrote in his diary, "I had flown only 1 hour above 20,000 feet. My first real practice firing was in combat. Many were killed before they ever reached the altitude where American bombers flew." The Luftwaffe was sending young men into the sky with barely enough experience to stay aloft, and expecting them to survive encounters with some of the best-trained pilots in the world. That alone was a tragedy, and it set the stage for what happened next. Even without Allied fighters present, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft and pilots at an accelerating rate. Engine failures, takeoff accidents, landing crashes, mid-air collisions inside their own formations, fuel starvation, maintenance shortcuts, structural fatigue due to lack of parts. One JG-300 pilot reported that on a single night intercept mission, they lost more aircraft to takeoff accidents than to actual combat. This wasn't incompetence, it was starvation. Starvation of fuel, starvation of time, starvation of training. When your pilots fear the runway more than the enemy, you are no longer a fighting force. You are a force in free fall. Into this fragile, exhausted system came a new kind of American fighter. Not new in appearance, but new in capability. A P-51 Mustang burning 150 grade fuel did not simply perform better. It behaved like a different machine, faster acceleration, higher top speed, sharper throttle response, better high-altitude performance, more energy in climbs, more energy in dives, everything that a German pilot depended on to survive, speed, climb, dive, escape, was suddenly no longer enough. A Luftwaffe ace described his first encounter. They came from the sun too fast to be Mustangs. He didn't know they were Mustangs enhanced by chemistry. He only knew that nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he saw. German fighters had always relied on one fundamental tactic: choose the engagement. If they didn't like the odds, they left. If they faced too many escorts, they aborted. If they needed space, they dove away or climbed away. But a Mustang burning 150 grade fuel removed that option. A Bf-109 caught in a climb was doomed. An FW-190 trying to dive away was doomed. A German formation trying to break into smaller groups was doomed. A P-51 could close distance rapidly, fire from a position of energy advantage, zoom back to altitude, dive with control, climb back into the fight, repeat as many times as needed. German pilots described the new Mustangs as predators, not because of their tactics, but because the Germans were losing the ability to run. That psychological shift, the loss of the escape route, broke something inside the Luftwaffe that could never be repaired. Inside every Merlin engine running on 150 grade fuel, a small war was taking place. Higher cylinder pressures, greater heat, heavier load on connecting rods, greater strain on bearings. Spark plugs pushed near their limits. The engine should have torn itself apart, but it didn't. The fuel's chemical stability allowed the Merlin to survive conditions Rolls-Royce had never intended. If any other fuel had been in the tank, the engine would have detonated, seized, or exploded. German engines, especially the DB605 and the BMW 801, could not survive such abuse, even with C3 fuel. This meant German fighters were constrained by engineering limits. American fighters were freed from theirs. The Luftwaffe entered each fight with built-in boundaries. The Mustangs entered the fight with almost none. Luftwaffe pilots feared the Mustangs, but more importantly, they feared the knowledge that they could not escape them. This fear grew into something deeper. A pilot from JG-11 wrote, "I could not see the enemy, but I felt he was there, above, behind, waiting." Another pilot described hearing only one sound: the wind in my canopy and the knowledge the Americans could find us first. The psychological collapse spread across squadrons. Pilots aborted missions. Pilots refused deep interception. Pilots stayed low to avoid radar. Formations broke apart. Individual pilots acted without orders. This wasn't cowardice. It was a survival instinct being crushed by reality. You cannot fight when you know the enemy will catch you. You cannot win when you no longer believe escape is possible. This was the real hell within. JG-300 was thrown into nighttime interception missions, daytime interception missions, and emergency scrambles. They suffered fuel starvation, catastrophic losses, pilot exhaustion, near constant operational stress, radar failures, friendly fire incidents, inexperienced replacements. In July 1944 alone, they lost more pilots to accidents and miscoordination than to direct combat. A surviving pilot said, "We did not fear the Americans. We feared the darkness of our own situation." By the time Mustangs with 150 grade fuel appeared over their airfields, JG-300 had already been hollowed out. The Mustang was simply the blow that shattered what remained. In the second half of 1944, Mustang groups began patrolling above German airfields. not just to intercept fighters in the air, but to destroy them as they took off. German pilots called this the dead minute, the seconds after wheels left the runway. When the aircraft was slow, vulnerable, predictable, a Mustang closing at 440 plus miles per hour needed only one pass. JG-1 wrote in their logs, "We are being killed before the fight begins." JG-11 wrote, "Takeoff is now a death sentence." Some pilots never saw the aircraft that killed them. Some never reached 100 meters altitude. Some died in aircraft with brand new engines and full ammunition loads without ever seeing combat. The Luftwaffe was dying not in battle, but in the vulnerable seconds between earth and sky. That is what air superiority truly means. To American pilots, the new fuel didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like margin. It felt like confidence. It felt like certainty. Radio calls were calm, boost to 75. "He's not climbing with you. Take him. Brake left, I'm on him. Clear your 6, I got him." There was no shouting, no panic, no desperation. Mustang pilots fought with the cold assurance of a force that knew its edge was real, not imagined. Meanwhile, German pilots were dying in machines that could no longer save them. The contrast could not have been clearer. The deadliest part of the hell within was not the fuel, nor the Mustangs, nor the bombers. It was the slow collapse of belief that training mattered, experience mattered, tactics mattered, courage mattered, aircraft performance mattered. When every factor that once protected a pilot becomes irrelevant, what remains? Only fear. And fear kills faster than oxygen starvation, engine fire, or a burst of .50 caliber rounds. Fear makes a pilot hesitate for 1 second. 1 second is enough to die. By late 1944, hesitation had invaded every Luftwaffe cockpit. There was no anti-fear training, no manual, no countermeasure. The Luftwaffe died in the mind before it died in the sky. 150-grade fuel did not create the Luftwaffe's collapse. It exposed it. It ripped away the last edges German pilots believed they had, the last confidence they carried into battle, the last illusion that skill alone could save them. When a system is breaking, the smallest push can shatter it. And in 1944, the push came from a liquid dyed purple, a liquid that gave the Mustang 5 to 10 miles per hour more in climbs, 25 to 30 miles per hour more at altitude, sharper throttle response, greater energy retention. Numbers small on paper, but enormous when life and death are measured in seconds. That margin was the difference between escape or no escape, pursuit or no pursuit, survival or no survival. The Luftwaffe did not lose because it fought poorly. It lost because it fought an enemy that had removed the last path to victory. The Mustangs with 150-grade fuel did not destroy the Luftwaffe from the outside. They finished what had already begun from the inside. This was the hell within. The winter of 1944-45 settled over Germany like a heavy shroud. Airfields from the Ruhr to Bavaria were lined with silent rows of Bf-109s and FW-190s, their fuselages dusted with snow, their tires frozen into the earth. From a distance, they looked like an army ready to rise into the sky the moment a commander gave the order. But this was an illusion. Most of those aircraft would never fly again. Not because they had been shot down, not because they lacked engines, guns, or wings, but because the one thing required to make them live, the one thing so simple yet so decisive, was gone. Fuel. The Allied bombing campaign against German oil production had succeeded beyond expectation. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Berlin, Lützgendorf, Merseburg, and Politz lay in ruins. Rail lines that once carried coal to hydrogenation plants were shattered. Repair crews worked day and night, but the bombs returned faster than repairs could be made. The Luftwaffe's bloodstream had run dry. Across dozens of bases, fighter commanders received fuel allocations so small that a full day's flying amounted to 10 minutes per trainee, or one climb to altitude for a single aircraft, or one scramble per squadron with no reserves. Some units had to tow their aircraft by horse because trucks had no fuel. A pilot from JG-301 described the scene. There were aircraft everywhere, but they were corpses We stood among them like undertakers. Even before the Mustangs arrived overhead, the Luftwaffe had already entered its final days. While the German fighters lay grounded, the P-51 Mustangs were flying with a freedom rarely seen in war. American logistics, massive, redundant, overflowing, ensured that fuel depots were full, replacement engines arrived weekly. Aircraft lost in combat were replaced in days. Maintenance crews had the parts they needed. New aircraft rolled out of factories faster than they were lost. Most importantly, 150-grade fuel flowed in quantities that would have seemed impossible to German engineers. The United States produced aviation gasoline on an industrial scale the world had never seen. High-octane refineries operating at maximum capacity. Protected oil fields across Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Fleets of tankers crossing the Atlantic. Pipeline networks feeding East Coast ports. Storage depots in England filled months in advance. For every gallon of fuel the Luftwaffe received, the Allies delivered dozens. This asymmetry was not merely logistical, it was strategic. It meant Allied fighters could fly constant air patrols. They could escort bombers across Germany. They could sweep airfields. They could hunt trains, trucks, and convoys. They could return to base, refuel, and launch again within hours. There was no pause, no shortage, no hesitation. The Luftwaffe fought with scarcity. The Americans fought with abundance. And in aerial warfare, abundance wins. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack intended to cripple Allied air power by destroying fighters on the ground. It was Germany's final attempt to reverse the momentum of the air war. Hundreds of fighters, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even a few remaining ground attack units, were sent to strike Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. The plan required perfect navigation, precise timing, tight radio silence, coordinated execution, experienced pilots. But by 1945, the Luftwaffe possessed none of these. Many pilots got lost due to inadequate training. Others were shot down by German flak units that had never been informed about the operation. Fuel shortages meant squadrons launched with barely enough fuel to complete the flight. Maintenance shortages meant many aircraft suffered mechanical failures mid-mission. The attack inflicted damage, but at a cost Germany could not sustain. In a single day, 277 German fighters were destroyed. 200-plus pilots were lost. Many of the remaining veterans died. One German commander wrote afterward, "We destroyed our last hope with our own hands." What Bodenplatte revealed was not German boldness, but German desperation. The Luftwaffe had gambled everything and lost. After Bodenplatte collapsed, the Allies intensified their pressure. With 150-grade fuel feeding the Merlins, P-51 squadrons swept over Germany with unstoppable presence. Their mission profile expanded morning patrols over airfields, bomber escort at midday, train strafing runs in the afternoon, low-level sweeps at dusk. By March 1945, many Luftwaffe airfields resembled graveyards. Burned-out fuselages, shattered canopies, wrecked hangars, demolished fuel depots, abandoned maintenance bays. Pilots attempting to take off often died on the runway. Those who managed to lift off were hunted immediately by Mustangs circling overhead. JG-1 reported, "We lose more aircraft taking off than fighting." JG-11 reported, "Our young pilots last minutes, not hours." Even the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, fell victim. It was powerful in the air but vulnerable during takeoff. Mustang groups waited for them and destroyed them as they climbed slowly off the runway. The Luftwaffe had no countermeasure for air supremacy this complete. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was a force in name only. Many squadrons had no fuel, no remaining veterans, no replacement engines, no spare tires, no radar support, no trained mechanics. The few pilots who could still fly were ordered into suicidal missions, ramming attacks, low-altitude intercepts, impossible scrambles with empty fuel tanks. A young pilot from JG-301 wrote on April 12th, "There is nothing left to defend. There is nothing left to win. We fly because we are told to, and we die because we have no choice." By mid-April, most fighter units were grounded. German cities lay in ruins. Allied bombers met no resistance. The last operational Me-262s ran out of fuel. Command orders dissolved into chaos. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in a final battle. It had dissolved. On the day Germany surrendered, the skies over Europe were quiet. No interceptors rose to challenge the bombers. No radar operators scrambled squadrons. No fighter controllers barked orders into their headsets. No German pilot waited nervously in a cockpit. Everything was still. For the American pilots who had fought since 1943, the silence was almost unsettling. They had spent years expecting danger at any moment. Now there was only sky. Mustang pilots flew their final missions over a defeated nation, gliding above airfields where aircraft sat untouched, their fuel tanks empty, their pilots gone, their legacy shattered. The war had ended not with a final duel, but with the disappearance of one side entirely. Looking back at the air war, historians tend to focus on the P-51 Mustang, the B-17 and B-24, the Spitfire, the Me-262, the radar networks, the aces on both sides. But the true decisive factor was often not the aircraft or the pilots. It was the machinery behind them, the refineries, the fuel depots, the chemical plants, the cracking towers, the rail networks, the industrial workers. 150-grade fuel was not glamorous. It was not a weapon. It did not fire bullets or drop bombs. Yet it changed the war. It transformed good fighters into exceptional fighters, balanced duels into one-sided hunts, contested airspace into Allied territory. It shortened dogfights, missions, casualty lists, and ultimately, the war itself. The Luftwaffe did not lose because it fought poorly. It lost because it fought against a nation whose industrial capacity removed every limitation, including the limitations of physics. In this sense, 150-grade fuel was not just a technical achievement. It was the moment when chemistry became strategy, the moment when a refinery became a weapon, the moment when the war's outcome shifted from the sky to the laboratory. A purple liquid, made far from any battlefield, decided battles fought thousands of miles away. History celebrates the pilots who fought, commanders who strategized, aircraft that soared, battles that defined eras. But victory in the air was shaped by people who never left the ground, chemists who perfected anti-detonation blends, refinery engineers who built catalytic cracking towers, workers who operated valves and pumps, sailors who shipped millions of gallons across oceans, mechanics who cleaned spark plugs blackened by lead, truck drivers who delivered fuel in the rain and snow, factory laborers who kept assembly lines moving, engineers who tested fuels until engines screamed. They did not fire guns. They did not see the enemy. They did not feel G-forces, but they gave the Mustang its edge, the edge that ended the air war. In the end, one truth emerges. The war for the skies of Europe was not only won by pilots, it was won by the people who built the fuel that allowed the pilots to prevail. That is the legacy of 150-grade fuel. A legacy written not in aircraft aluminum, but in chemistry, pressure gauges, and the purple glow of a liquid that changed history.